Hey everybody, it is Monday, August 4th, the first Monday of this month. You're listening to the Mo News podcast. I'm Moshe Manunu.
And I am Jill Wagner. This is the place where we bring you just the facts.
And we read all the news and read between the lines so you don't have to. And I check what's trending on X so you don't have to, which is typically not good. If you're trending, if you're like a top 10 trending topic on Twitter/X, it's not good. And then I saw that hashtag Chicago was trending, which I was like, oh God, like I'm from Chicago. What does this mean? But it turns out, Jill, it's actually good news, at least as of when I last checked. It's all the people attending Lollapalooza this weekend in Chicago.
Yes, and when you look up Lollapalooza, Weezer and Olivia Rodrigo did a joint performance, and it was pretty good. Let's play a little bit of it.
Jill, it's sort of Gen X meets Gen Z at Lollapalooza, right? Like Weezer and Olivia Rodrigo. I know, and us millennials would like to also include, as Weezer fans, but I don't want to. There's a lot of people in Gen X that constantly are like, you guys constantly are cutting us out of the conversation. So I'm going to give Weezer to Gen X, even though as millennials will also claim it.
By the way, Moshe, I'm technically Gen X. I'm on the cusp, but I'm technically the first. Yes.
Yeah.
But I don't want people who are listening who are Gen Xers to feel like they're left out of the conversation because I'm technically a Gen Xer. So I'm at the younger end of it, but you're my people.
Right. And I'm technically the oldest year of millennials, which I went over with Pete Buttigieg in our interview because we're both born in 82. And actually, several years younger than us, which is pretty incredible. Jill, this weekend was J.D. Vance's 41st birthday.
Oh my God!
He's the vice president.
He's a real millennial.
He's a real millennial. Like he's our first millennial, like who's either VP or president. Because like until now, it's only been boomers and up. Like Gen X still hasn't been in there. Well, actually, Gen X could try to take Kamala Harris, who's born in 64. They typically say that Gen X started around 65. But yeah, first millennial president or vice president is J.D. Vance, who turned 41 on Sunday. By the way, Jill, we should note as we talk about presidential birthdays and VP's birthdays, today is actually Barack Obama's birthday. He turns 64 years old today, born in 61.
Okay, happy birthday, President Obama. All right, to the headlines. First, President Trump goes after the head of the Federal Reserve. Now he's taking aim at the head of the government agency that puts out jobs numbers. Why President Trump actually fired the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the reaction to it.
Jill, we'll dive into the controversy here, how the BLS does its thing, and what this potentially could mean for the reliability of economic figures.
Overseas, President Trump said he moved 2 nuclear submarines closer to Russia, a response to remarks made by a past Russian president. What he said. A reversal of a campaign promise. Trump reportedly has no plans to force insurance companies or the government to pay for IVF treatment. We'll break down the latest.
This was a big theme of last year's campaign, an issue I know a number of you have been asking about.
In other health news, vaccination rates for kindergartners in the United States are at the lowest levels we've seen in at least a decade. We'll talk about the trend. In tech, OpenAI saying it will no longer have ChatGPT conversations show up in Google searches.
Yes, you may have seen this story. You may have freaked out. There's been a development over the weekend.
And American Eagle finally speaking out after days of controversy following the release of its Sydney Sweeney jeans campaign. We told you about it last week, and perhaps a sign of the times, the company not offering any apologies.
Yes, the times have changed in terms of how corporations are handling so-called cancel culture. We'll break it down.
And finally, Moshe has on this day in history.
Your clue today: if you're not first, you're last.
Moshe, I'm liking the quotes as hints.
It's from one of my favorite eras of comedies. So we're going to go with that. Some of you may have already shouted the answer in your as you listen to this. I'll give you one more quote. I'll come at you like a spider monkey. Jill, okay, I clearly saw this film way more than you saw this film.
I feel like you could go on. Like, okay, fine, one more clue.
Oh, don't worry. I will. And on this day in history.
Okay, after a dismal jobs report was released Friday, President Trump firing the head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, Erica McIntarfer. So the numbers showed a pretty significant slowdown in hiring. And the president claimed that the numbers were, quote, phony. He wrote on Truth Social that the numbers were rigged to make him and Republicans look bad. A lot to unpack here. So let's start with the numbers. According to the report, only 73,000 jobs were added last month, which is a stark difference from the 115,000 expected. And even more significantly, the report revised the numbers from May and June, reducing the jobs added in those months by 258,000. So the Bureau has been putting out these reports since the 1970s, and it will often revise the numbers in later months as more data comes in. So while revisions to previous months are common, it was the unusually high number of revisions that came as a surprise and really suggested that the labor market was not as resilient as it had seemed earlier this summer. The numbers are considered among the most important figures that Wall Street and the Fed look at. And the Bureau of Labor Statistics is staffed with appointees and lifelong civil servants who came in during both Republican and Democratic administrations. Moshe, having worked as the Money Watch correspondent at the New York Stock Exchange for many years, the jobs report is that one big monthly report that even people outside of Wall Street tend to pay attention to.
Yeah, it's significant. It is, as one could describe it, a gold standard report, even with its flaws and the need to tweak it over time, and has a huge impact, not just on Wall Street, Jill, but also in Washington at the Federal Reserve as they make huge decisions regarding interest rates.
So now to the firing. President Trump unleashed his fury about weakness in the labor market on Friday. He said, without providing evidence that the data was rigged and that he was firing the official responsible for pulling together the numbers each month. Erica McIntarfer, the commissioner of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, was actually confirmed to the role on a bipartisan basis in 2024 by an overwhelming 86-8 vote in the Senate among the people who voted for her. Vice President J.D. Vance, who was then a senator, here is a bit of Trump explaining the decision on Friday afternoon on Newsmax, a conservative cable network.
And we had some difficulties with her, and there have been a lot of questions, and we fired her because we didn't believe the numbers today. Even though interest rates are too high, we have a terrible head of the Fed. He keeps interest rates too high. And I could understand that, but I don't believe those numbers, I think, because we're doing so well.
So, Jill, that was a bit of his explanation there. And it's interesting because when the numbers initially came out, Jill, the line from the White House was different. In explaining the revision of the numbers, the chair of the White House Council of Economic Advisors went on CNBC, and they're typically like, hey, what happened? And he said this had to do with a quirk in the seasonal adjustment process and noted that the president's immigration policies may have had an impact here. No mention of manipulated data. They even tried to say this was a pretty decent jobs report. But Trump then chimes in a couple hours later saying, no, this is totally biased. And the entire White House messaging was altered around that. He then went ahead and said, it sounds like based on the interview, he found out that like he has the power to fire this person. He didn't like the results. And so he's been complaining for a while that he doesn't feel the numbers are reflective of the economy that he believes exists out there. And the numbers are pretty stark, right? These revisions were stark, as you mentioned, because effectively what this report means is that only about 100,000 jobs were added over 3 months, when initial reports and expectations were going to be closer to 400,000 jobs over the last 3 months. The initial May report showed 144,000 jobs. Now the revision just shows 19,000 jobs added in May. June, initially, 147,000 jobs were shown to be added. The revision, 14,000. And now you have the July jobs gained at just 73,000. We'll see what the revision says there. Now, revisions are not a new thing, and they've never really been a partisan thing. If you recall, let's take you back to last August of 2024, when the Bureau said employers had added actually 818,000 fewer jobs over 2023 to 2024 than previously believed. That happened on Biden's watch. That was bad news for Biden and Kamala Harris going to the election. They basically revised things down. Now, Trump has tried to make, and including in this interview, this all about, well, no, they're trying to make me look bad. Well, ultimately, Trump has also said they revised it after the election. No, they didn't. They revised it. At least this major revision happened while Biden was still president, which again went against what Biden was trying to argue, the Biden economy, Bidenomics, etc. The job growth was already slowing down at that point last year. Now they had these downward revisions again. At the time, by the way, I should note, Trump put on social media last year, massive scandal in all caps in regards to these revisions. But the numbers over time, the BLS report, which has come out since the 1970s, they continue to have these revisions because they depend on surveys from about 630,000 work sites around the country to project a nationwide estimate for how many jobs have been created or lost. In fact, Jill, we talked about this over on the premium Instagram feed over the weekend. A number of you in the Mo News community are either involved or directly in charge of filling out that survey data for BLS. So you were telling me about this process and how long it takes and how some of you don't get to it every month. And you might come in later and be like, okay, I'll finally get to those main numbers. Or based on your QuickBooks and your basic numbers, you just have incomplete data based on hiring and firing, depending on the size of your company. So you will then update those numbers. And accordingly, BLS will say, okay, here are the latest numbers. By the way, we have revisions on the previous months. Now, one of the issues they face also is that until recently, the response rate was about 60% on surveys, which is a number that they like to be at. In recent years, it's gone down to 40% in terms of response rate. So now you're seeing fewer businesses fill out this survey data. And so what does that mean? Well, less reliable information until you get more data in for the economy. And so I think there's general agreement that there needs to be a better system here in the modern economy, the gig economy, people getting out of the kind of typical workforce, entrepreneurship. COVID threw a lot of things out of whack, including maybe how to collect these jobs numbers. And given how digitized everything is these days, there's got to be a better way here to figure this out. But the criticism right now from Democrats, obviously, but including a number of Republicans, Jill, is that there's no indication here that McIntyre was partisan in any way. The BLS might have its issues, but it does not appear, no one has evidence, including a number of Republicans, including the White House was struggling with this yesterday when they were asked about this from reporters. Like, what is your evidence that she was trying to make the president look bad here, given how important this jobs number is and how it basically makes the Fed tick, it makes the Wall Street tick, it makes everyone tick.
I also found it to be pretty ironic because a weaker jobs number and the jobs market showing weakness overall actually makes the Fed much more likely to lower interest rates at its next meeting. It's one of the big criteria that the Fed chair always talks about. The job market, he always says, is still strong, which gives him a little bit more leeway to say we're not going to cut rates just yet because the economy is still doing pretty well. We'd rather get inflation under control. So Trump, who has just been railing at Jerome Powell and calling him too late, Powell, and a million other things, a moron, all of that, this jobs number and the revisions to the past 2 months would actually probably make
Jill,
Powell lower interest rates.
It actually literally would reinforce too late Powell, right?
Correct. Correct.
May is now terrible. June was terrible. July was terrible. So, funny you should mention it. If somebody got into the president being like, actually, Mr. President, we shouldn't go after this because this actually proves your point that this is too late Powell, right? That the jobs situation has been bad since May. But the thing about Trump is that would actually have to mean that he admits that something is bad, that something is not good on his watch, which would be the jobs report, right? But he can't admit that. He needs everything to be greater than before. So he wants to be able to say, yes, it's too late, Powell, but also I've created 1 million jobs, but you should also be lowering interest rates. He wants to have all of it. Now, as far as the reaction here, I mentioned Democrats and Republicans. Democrats, not surprisingly, calling this out. Chuck Schumer from the Senate saying this is shooting the messenger of BLS as opposed to just acknowledging the reality. The senator from New Mexico, Martin Heinrich, actually called it, quote, pure Soviet shit in terms of firing the head of the statistics agency. But then you had Republican lawmaker Cynthia Lummis of Wyoming, a Republican, saying it's not the statistician's fault if the numbers are accurate and they're not what the president hoped for. Tom Tillis, North Carolina, of course, he's retiring, but willing to be critical of the White House, one of the reasons he's not running for re-election, said that if she was fired because the president or whoever didn't like the numbers, then they ought to grow up, was his message. You also had the former head of the Bureau of Labor Statistics during the first Trump administration, William Beach, saying that this firing sets a dangerous precedent and undermines the statistical mission of the Bureau. So notable that this was a former Trump guy that said, come on, I know her, and she is a straight shooter when it comes to this sort of thing.
And Moshe, as you mentioned, the Bureau of Labor Statistics has had its share of criticism in the past. It came under scrutiny last year when there were issues with the timing of data releases. The problems led to a report which found that the accuracy of the data was not in question. Yet the report pointed out the importance of perception, saying, quote, how successfully BLS releases its data products and supporting materials impacts the public's perception of the credibility of the data.
Yeah, this is a huge thing. We've seen a loss of trust when it comes to a number of agencies and institutions, right, over the years. The FBI, the Supreme Court, the CIA, the CDC, the FDA. We could go on and on. And, in some of those cases, until a few years ago, the vast majority of the public trusted some of those organizations. That's no longer the case. This is one where, again, Wall Street, the Fed, a number of huge economic questions are based on the BLS report here. Now, there is an alternate report called the ADP report that only handles private businesses. That's based on payroll data. The BLS numbers are private and government hiring, and that's based on these surveys. But ultimately here, BLS, they still need this to be great, and that's why there's a lot of concern about who he hires next. At the same time, given how crucial this is for the markets and for business, at the end of the day, even as some names are thrown around, he put in Scott Bessent as Treasury Secretary because ultimately the markets wanted a serious person in there, and that would be reflected poorly in the market if he didn't have a serious person in there. And so in this case, there is hope that even whomever he puts in there, A, the market will need to sort of give its tacit approval, and B, BLS still has nearly 2,000 people who work at it, who are all, economists who just want to have straight numbers. And so in attempting to manipulate jobs numbers every month would be very difficult and ultimately would have a lot of people internally outspoken. So it's something we are watching closely.
All right, sticking with politics, let's head to Texas, where Texas Democrats are fleeing the state to try to prevent the state House from voting on a new congressional map that heavily favors the GOP. This fight has ramifications for who controls the U.S. Congress after next year's midterm elections. So the fight has led to Democrats in the state taking extreme measures in order to prevent a quorum from being met. Without a quorum, a vote cannot happen. Hence, why they are leaving town. Those who leave, though, could face fines, and the state attorney general has even threatened arresting them. It comes as President Trump has been pressuring the state to draw a new map as he works to retain a majority in Congress in what historically is a difficult year for the party that holds the White House. So typically, who's ever in the White House loses the Congress in the midterm elections if that party is already controlling Congress.
Right. He at least loses seats, if not loses Congress, but especially given how slim the majority is in the House, that sort of would have been a given historically. The Senate's going to be slightly more of a challenge, but that's why there's so much focus here on the House. Those of you who are familiar with the U.S. Constitution, you know that typically redistricting happens every 10 years after we have a census, which is in the Constitution. We do a census, population moves, states reallocate based on populations that have moved and redraw the districts. Now, going on 200 years here, that redistricting process, the redrawing of districts, not solely based on where people moved, but drawn in a way to help your party. It's called gerrymandering. We discussed the history of it on a recent podcast. We have a clip up over on Instagram, but ultimately that's the way many states go. If you're a Democratic majority state, you try to squeeze in more Democratic seats. If you're a Republican majority state, you try to squeeze in more Republican seats. Now, typically there are then lawsuits. Those go before judges, and the judges make determinations on what to happen. Now, in Texas, you have a Republican majority. About 55% of the state are Republicans. But based on gerrymandering in recent decades, about 2/3 of current U.S. House seats are controlled by Republicans. And if they add these additional 5, Joe, in a state that has 55% Republicans, they would control 80% of the U.S. House seats. Now, how do they do this? Well, the way you kind of gerrymander is you draw up cities, if you're a Republican, like pizza. Consider Houston or Dallas or Austin, and you slice it up like a pizza, Austin in the middle. And so basically, if you were supposed, if Austin's right there in the middle of the pizza, well, think about all the slices going different directions. And then the outside slices are those kind of rural Republican areas. So, a place like Austin or, these major cities, you're represented now by like 6, 7, 8 different Republican members of Congress, even if your across the street neighbor is represented by another one. In a city, that's pretty liberal, if that makes sense.
Actually, it's the only thing that's ever made sense. I've never understood this issue better.
Okay, so good. So think about Austin being the center of the pizza. Now flip it in some blue states. If you're in a heavily Republican area, like let's take Illinois for example, right? You try to bring in every rural area of Illinois and you bring it into a Chicago district, the opposite direction. But you ensure that district is majority Chicago, minority sort of rural, more exurb red areas. Whereas in Texas, you ensure that that district, as you slice up Austin like a pizza in the center, is minority Austin, majority outside areas. And that's how this game goes. In blue states, like Maryland, Illinois, California, New York, which gerrymander that way, Texas, which gerrymanders the other way. Now, what's significant here is this is not a year that ends in zero that just had a census or the year after. This is the year 2025. We're 5 years removed from a census. We're 5 years before the next census. But Texas has a law that allows them to reslice things as many times as they want. And so in this case, they're going ahead and doing that, especially at the behest of President Trump, who wants those 5 extra seats. It'll give him some pad if he loses seats somewhere else next year. The Democrats are upset about this. And so they have escaped, a number of them, of the 51 Democrats, a number of them are headed to Chicago. That's where the Illinois governor, J.B. Pritzker, says he's providing logistical support to keep them there. A number of Texas Democrats will also head to Boston and Albany, New York as well. Notably, Jill, if Texas moves ahead with this, and eventually this delay tactic, which they tried 20 years ago, Democrats did, eventually they were forced to return. That'll likely happen again. I think down the road here, this redistricting will happen given the Republicans have the votes here. This is a delay tactic by Democrats. But what have Democrats said nationally? Hey, Gavin Newsom, governor of California. Hey, J.B. Pritzker, governor of Illinois. Hey, Kathy Hochul, governor of New York. If Texas does this, maybe it's time for you guys to redistrict mid-10-year cycle. And add a couple seats for us. And so this could really, if gerrymandering was a problem for U.S. democracy, check, it is. This will really supercharge it in a way, and it's a story that we'll continue to be watching here. But Jill, I should end this by saying this all appears to be legal right now. Certainly there'll be a lot of lawsuits related to this, but the Constitution, the Supreme Court hasn't said you can't do this mid-10-year cycle redistrict. At least they haven't yet.
Time now for the speed read from Politico. Amid escalating tensions with Russia, President Trump said Friday that he ordered 2 nuclear submarines to be positioned in what he said were the appropriate regions near the country. It came after former Russian President Dmitry Medvedev made what Trump called, quote, highly provocative statements. The two have been going back and forth in a war of words. At one point, via the Telegram chat app, Medvedev referenced Russia's nuclear capabilities, which appears to have spurred Trump's surprising announcement about the submarines. Surprising because plans like these are typically kept close to the vest. They're not made public. He told reporters that a threat was made by a former president of Russia, and we are going to protect our people.
Yeah, it's like that old movie Fight Club. Like the first rule of Fight Club is you don't talk about Fight Club. Like the first rule of having nuclear submarines is you don't talk about nuclear submarines. Like the Pentagon, like if you ever said like, hey, what's up with nuclear submarines? Like, where do you have them? They're like, what submarines? Like, what are you talking about? Like, and so the fact that Trump's like, I'm moving 2 nuclear submarines effectively closer to Russia here is, not insignificant. We don't know what he means. We don't know where they were before that. Well, by the way, we should also mention that submarines can both be nuclear powered and nuclear armed. Now, we probably, think he means the latter here based on these conversations. But again, Trump didn't really clarify here. A little bit here on Medvedev. Medvedev is effectively Putin's lackey. At one point, when Putin was trying to follow the laws in Russia, he allowed Medvedev to be president for 4 years and then made him prime minister again. Basically, technically Putin was prime minister, but was really still calling the shots. And so he now has effectively moved to the Russian Security Council, where it appears he spends most of his time just talking smack on social media. That's what Medvedev, he drops nuclear missiles here and nuclear missiles there. I mean, half the headlines from the past 2 years, Jill, about we're going to use nukes is just Dmitry Medvedev, unclear his sobriety, just tweeting stuff. And so it appears in recent months, he's decided to start going after Trump and messing with him. Trump has clearly taken notice here. Honestly, he also makes Trump's social media stream look tame at times, based on what Medvedev writes and how hyperbolic he can be. So he made a reference to the Dead Hand, which is the nuclear weapons system developed during the Cold War by the Soviet Union. Trump clearly took attention to that. And so ultimately, that is what has led to this recent round.
Some background here. Last week was one of increasingly heightened tensions between the U.S. and Russia. Trump said that he was implementing a new deadline for Russia to come to a ceasefire agreement with Ukraine, giving the country just 10 to 12 days. If not met, Trump said Russia would face secondary tariffs. Medvedev was obviously not happy, taking to X and writing that, quote, each new ultimatum is a threat and a step towards war, not between Russia and Ukraine, but with his own country. So to that, Trump warned Medvedev to watch his words, saying that he was entering very dangerous territory.
Yeah, so, obviously this headline is concerning, but again, the background here is this is Medvedev, talking smack, and Trump trying to call him out on it. I haven't seen Medvedev's response as of this nuclear submarine move, so I don't know if Putin told him to cut it out, at least for now. But we'll see what happens, and I wouldn't freak out over the whole nuclear submarines moving towards Russia thing, at least not yet.
From the Washington Post, an IVF backtrack from the White House. The president has no plans to mandate IVF coverage, despite promising to do so while on the campaign trail last August. Trump had said that if he won the presidency, he would either mandate that insurance companies cover IVF or have the government pay for IVF services. But right now, neither of the two options appear to be in play. President Trump signed an executive order earlier this year directing the government to expand access to IVF and reduce the costs of the popular fertility treatment. White House officials say expanding IVF access remains a priority, but legal constraints prevent mandating coverage without congressional approval, and no bill is currently planned. The White House says the president is still pledging to expand access to fertility treatments for Americans who are struggling to start families. If IVF were to be included in the coverage for millions of people participating in the Affordable Care Act exchanges, it would mean premium costs would go up, and that is not a good look for the GOP as the country approaches the 2026 midterms.
So this is something we told you about last year when Trump made this promise, that this was going to be a very difficult promise to keep because of how expensive this would end up being, and that a lot of Republicans in Congress were not willing to go there. And that appears to be the only route, because the officials of the White House have weighed requiring IVF to be considered a, quote, essential health benefit under the Affordable Care Act, aka Obamacare, which would require insurers in the marketplace to cover it. But then that will increase premiums, as you mentioned, Jill. So that's been a concern here. It does come, as Trump has said, he wanted to be, he's called himself the fertility president and given himself various names. He just signed an incentive into the latest law, that big, beautiful bill, that babies born this year through 2028 can receive $1,000 from the U.S. government. He said he hopes that will help with the baby boom here. We have talked about how the fertility rate and birth rate has been dropping for years in the U.S., but covering IVF has been a divisive topic, including on the right, because, of course, the IVF process also entails creating a number of embryos in order to have the best chance of having a healthy child. That sometimes means destroying some embryos or donating them to science. And so that's obviously controversial with social conservatives, some of whom believe that embryo is already a human life and should be considered a human life. And so that's been controversial as well. So they've been trying to strike somewhere in the middle there, at least Trump has, as far as his party's concerned, but he can't get the party aboard with covering IVF, at least not yet. But there were some Democrats we've spoken to who were hoping to work with the president on that. We'll watch the reaction.
Sticking with health news from Mo News, vaccination rates for U.S. kindergartners dropped to their lowest levels in at least a decade as vaccination exemptions rose to an all-time high. This is according to some data released late last week from the CDC. During the 2024-25 school year, 3.6% of kindergartners, or about 138,000 kids, had vaccine exemptions for at least one vaccine. That is up from 3.3% during the previous school year. Vaccination exemptions rose in 36 states and Washington, D.C., and almost all vaccine exemptions were listed as non-medical, meaning that they were given for either religious or personal reasons.
Yeah, and so the rate here when it comes to kindergartners apparently decreased for all reported vaccines compared to the year before. And this is a trend line, Jill, we have been seeing since COVID. We've also seen how partisan it's become, with the rates among Democrats pretty much consistent with where they were. Republicans and some independents have been dropping over the last couple of years in sort of the aftermath of the COVID vaccine. Now, we will see what effect the fact that there's been a measles surge this year has on this. There is some hope that given all the headlines about measles and the outbreak, the worst outbreak we've seen in a couple decades now, whether that'll now cause some people to reconsider the exceptions. But one reason why they're watching this so closely is that, especially when it comes to measles, first of all, it's super, super contagious, right? But number two, the immunization rate for the vaccine, the measles vaccine, has stayed steady in recent years at 95%. That's the level you need of vaccination to basically protect and prevent it from spreading in the community. Now, it dipped to 93.9% during the COVID year. It has continued to decline over time. Last year, 92.5% of kindergartners had received the shots, so down from 95, down to 92.5. We'll watch again this year, but that again means one infected kid could infect a larger group if ultimately there are a few kids in that classroom who don't have the vaccine. And that's particularly what we've been seeing happen in West Texas and that Mennonite community there, where it's really been spreading significantly.
To some business news now from Fast Company after public outcry upon the discovery that private ChatGPT conversations were showing up in Google searches. OpenAI says it has removed the opt-in feature allowing that to happen. Some of the conversations showing up in searches included very personal topics like mental health, relationships, sexual health, and drug use. Some background here. Fast Company reported last week that ChatGPT users may have inadvertently made their conversations with the AI chatbot public and searchable. The magazine report found nearly 4,500 ChatGPT conversations in Google search results. Fortunately, the public conversations didn't identify the users behind the posts, but there was enough information that could help you identify users if you knew enough about them.
Right, if you knew who they broke up with or recent health issues and put those things together. This apparently was all linked to the app's share feature. That's where there was an option leading many unknowing users to allow their chats to be publicly searchable. When they clicked share, they were able to then check off a box that said, make this chat discoverable. But in smaller, in very light text, there was an explainer as to what that meant. And apparently, well, who reads disclaimers, Joe? People just kind of moved on so they could share whatever ChatGPT conversation, not realizing that by opening up the share button, they were sharing it with the world. So a top official at OpenAI acknowledged that this introduces an issue here for too many opportunities for folks to accidentally share things they didn't intend to. They do say that they're also working to remove indexed content from relevant search engines, because remember, it's not just Google, there's DuckDuckGo and other search engines, and security and privacy are, quote, paramount for OpenAI. But ultimately, Jill, this is one of the things you need to keep in mind. I know everyone shares, everything going on in their lives with Google, and now does it with ChatGPT. In some cases, ChatGPT you're using as your therapist and a variety of other things. Well, ultimately, you're sharing things with a private organization, and if you don't read all the fine print, or they have features, or they look to sell this data, that is a concern you should have. So beware.
And finally, from the Associated Press, a follow-up to the controversial Sydney Sweeney jeans ad for American Eagle, playing on the idea of her physical jeans with a G and the jeans she wears with a J. In fact, the company is standing by the ad, saying that the campaign is and always was about the jeans, Jeans. In a video, Sweeney says, quote, genes are passed down from parents to offspring, often determining traits like hair color, personality, and even eye color. My genes are blue. The response comes after the jeans campaign sparked widespread controversy and debates about beauty standards and race.
Yeah, the blonde-haired, blue-eyed, 27-year-old actress, some on the progressive left on social media felt they were glorifying her blonde, blue-eyed genes, accusing them of even things like eugenics and racism by glorifying that, selective breeding. You have American Eagle saying, no, this was an ad about jeans. And this will also play on a Brooke Shields ad about jeans with a G versus jeans with a J in 1980. We should mention American Eagle has had a number of diverse spokespeople through the years, but ultimately in this case, there was some outcry, at least from a certain very vocal group about Sweeney. But it's interesting here, and the reason why we did the follow-up is that American Eagle is not backing down on this one. There was no apology. There wasn't even the normal corporate we're sorry if this offended you, or, we're going to try harder. We're going to hire a more diverse team. We're going to do this, that, and the other thing. None of that. This was about genes, God bless and good luck, effectively. And so it's interesting because this is very much a difference from what we saw, basically, if you say from 2016, 2017 through 2023, when if there was a very vocal outcry on social media, Jill, almost without fail, a company would potentially have a resignation, have an apology, talk about sensitivity training, talk about diversity training. They roll out a whole bunch of stuff, right? Hire a crisis firm. The CEO would go on TV. And it appears here the culture has very much shifted where corporations are like, you know what? We're not going to apologize for that, even though there's a very loud group. And by the way, our stock is up at American Eagle. And American Eagle can also say, like, we own Aerie, which has done an incredible job in recent years of being inclusive of women, different shapes, sizes, backgrounds, very much has promoted itself in a different way than, as a rival to Victoria's Secret and the images it was portraying. Executives actually made a decision several years ago not to retouch photos of models for Aerie. So American Eagle as a company is looking around being like, no, we think we're pretty good when it comes to this sort of thing. So that's very interesting.
Moshe, I think you hit the nail on the head in the beginning. The stock was up. Okay, the ad came out on a Wednesday. The stock within a couple of days was up almost 20% and sales were up also. So I think the company probably just looked at the bottom line and said, you know what? This ad with the controversy, maybe despite it or because of it, is making us some money. So no, we're not going to apologize for it.
And speaking of that, Jill, a company that went like super inclusive and some would say, quote, woke, in recent years, Jaguar, the car brand, the luxury car brand, completely revamped its look in recent years, showing models in this sort of like desperate, futuristic, diverse landscape. People are like, wait, what are you trying to sell here? Well,
is this a car commercial? Like, what's happening?
The sales have been abysmal. It was ridiculed across the board. It was not good for the bottom line, as the CEO just announced that they were leaving. So just to kind of show you at least a couple examples here of the trend line of where brands have gone. Overall, now, of course, it's different based on individual brands and where things are going, but you do sort of continue to see this pendulum swinging between, left to right. Of course, Bud Light had its issue with Dylan Mulvaney, but that was a whole issue related to trans, and that's a whole separate podcast. But as these stories develop, we'll try to highlight ones that we think tell, where we're at in terms of the bigger picture. All right, on this day in history, mentioned at the top, on this day in 1961, Barack Obama, our 44th president, was born. He is our youngest former president, just in his mid-60s now. When you run the numbers on our other former presidents, Biden is 82, Bush is 79, and Clinton will turn 79 later this month. Incidentally, Donald Trump, our current president, also 79. Fun fact, Trump, George W. Bush, Bill Clinton, all born within 2 months of each other in the summer of 46. But it so happens that one was elected the president in 92, and one, same age, well, he's our current president for at least 3.5 more years. On this day in 1944, Anne Frank and her family were discovered and arrested by the Gestapo in Amsterdam. On this day in 1964, the bodies of civil rights workers, Michael Schwerner, Andrew Goodman, and James Chaney, were discovered in Mississippi. Their disappearance and murder in what was called Freedom Summer, that was a campaign to register black voters in Mississippi, triggered a massive FBI investigation, wall-to-wall media coverage, especially given the fact that two of them were white Northerners. That drew additional national outrage here of what was happening in the South. And the public reaction to the murders of the three men actually helped create momentum for the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act that would be passed in the subsequent months. On this day in 1988, the U.S. Senate votes to give $20,000 in compensation and an apology to every Japanese American who was interned during World War II. If you're not familiar with this, one of the darkest spots in American history, about 120,000 Japanese Americans held in internment camps between 2 and 4 years during World War II. The feeling from FDR at the time was they couldn't be trusted. So a majority of these people were actually born in America, put in internment camps. And, on this day, more than 40 years later, they finally got at least an apology and some compensation. And we end here on some pop culture news. On this day in 2005, It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia premiered. So It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia is officially 20 years old today. And the answer to your clue at the top, everybody, turning 19 years old today. If you ain't first, you're last. I will come at you like a spider monkey. Shake and bake. Talladega Nights, starring John C. Reilly and Will Ferrell, premiered in theaters on this day in 2006. You remembering it now, Jill?
I never saw it, which is why it makes sense that I didn't get your clues.
Michael, I'm calling your husband immediately. Jill has some mandatory viewing this weekend.
All right, I know what I'm watching for the end of the week. Thank you all for listening to the Mo News podcast. If you like what you hear, please share this with your friends. It will help us grow. Follow us, subscribe so you don't miss an episode, and review us in the App Store.
If you don't review us in the App Store, I will come at you like a spider monkey.
And that can't be good.
It's not. No, it's not good. I like to think of Jesus wearing a tuxedo t-shirt. Jill, so many good lines. Also, Sacha Baron Cohen, coming off of like just being Ali G. This is a big appearance for him as he, would put out Borat and those films in later years. A little cinematic comedy history for you.
Okay, it's on the list.
Thanks for listening to the Mo News podcast. Have a fantastic day. I hope you enjoyed.